It's very striking that we have tried to create a polity where, on the one hand, the states all feel empowered. At the same time, the center exercises a certain controlling authority. In all the debates about federalism versus quasi-federalism, as some scholars have called it, the phrase I found the most interesting was the Supreme Court, and one of its judgments referred to our system as amphibian, in the sense that, just as an amphibian creature is able to walk on land and swim in the water, the Indian federalism is both federal and non-federal at the same time, and that's an unusual situation. But the practical consequences of this have to be looked at. And in terms of fiscal federalism, as I said, to add to what Mr. Balagopal has already shared with us, the very important observation that 65% of all tax revenues go to the center, whereas 64% of all expenditure is by the states. And this is an important paradox that partially explains some of the serious fiscal challenges facing the states. You also have a situation of imbalance amongst the states. So what you have, for example, is that a 1 rupee paid in tax by UP actually nets UP 1 rupee 79 paise back from the central government, whereas 1 rupee paid by Karnataka in tax gets them only 47 paise back. And this is the kind of disparity which has actually been widening with time. As the southern states have become more prosperous, as their economies have developed, while at the same time their population has been more effectively controlled, you have a situation where the states that have failed to control their population effectively, including because they've failed to empower their women effectively and so on, they have grown dramatically in population, and as a result, they have gained in political clout in our country and in fiscal benefits. The 15th Finance Commission was the first finance commission that was instructed by the center to actually abandon the formula of relying upon the 1971 census. Now, this is a long and hoary story, many of you are aware of it, but the 71 census was considered the last one in which essentially organic normal population growth had happened throughout the country. After 71, the introduction of population control by Indira Gandhi led to the 42nd Amendment in 1976, in which she said that we will freeze even the Lok Sabha representation at the level of the 1971 census in order to ensure that those who effectively implement population policies in the larger national interest do not get penalized for it, and that those who fail to implement population policies, whose populations get out of control, they should not be rewarded for it. And it's a very bold, impressive statement. And the finance commissions from that time onwards were also told, use the 71 census for your allocation of tax revenues to the states. Now, for 25 years, this went on without controversy. And interestingly enough, in 2001, a BJP government led by Atal Bihari Vajpayee decided to renew the same amendment for another 25 years without debate. It was passed unanimously in both houses. Now, what's interesting about that is this was despite the fact that already in those 25 years, there was a certain dissonance between the size of our population and our political representation on the one hand, and the size of the population of the northern states, particularly the so-called cow belt, the Hindi-speaking states of the north. They had a genuine, legitimate grounds for grievance that, for example, as their population grew, each MP, for example, had to represent more people than an MP in Kerala or Andhra Pradesh. Be that as it may, 25 years more was extended, and that lapses in 2026. Now, it was becoming very clear to many of us southern MPs that it was quite unlikely that this government, if they are in power in 2026, will at all be in favor of a further renewal. But the first indication that the amendment is doomed for 26 came in the instructions given to the 15th Finance Commission, which was told to take into account the 2011 census. Now, this is actually itself the beginning of a change in the stakes when it comes to fiscal federalism. But it is particularly, of course, ominous in the political sense, and I'll come to that in a couple of minutes. But just to say that if we look at the fiscal situation, the iniquities are actually measurable. So Karnataka is meeting 72% of its own expenses from its own taxes. Bihar is meeting only 23% of its expenses from its own taxes. In other words, 77% of Bihar's actual expenditure comes from the center. And in Karnataka's case, literally 28% is coming. Kerala, as our finance minister said, about 64% from our taxes, 36% from the center. Now, unlike most federal systems, in other words, we have an extremely unusual situation where India's revenues are going disproportionately to its worst performing states. Those with poor levels of education, high rates of fertility and population growth, whereas the high performance states in the south are getting short shrift. Now, I'm not here to create any sort of north-south disparities. We're all one country. But we do have to understand that there is a reason for this. There has been a dramatic difference, much more than ever envisaged in the 60s and 70s, a dramatic difference in population performance. So if you look at the last census, as you know, is 2011, I suspect these trends are going to be even more accentuated had we had a census in 2021. When we eventually have a census, we're going to find out. But in the 2001 to 2011 situation, we would find that Bihar, Jharkhand, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, and Uttar Pradesh all had a decadal population growth, that is per decade, of more than 20%. Whereas, if you look at the southern states, at that point Andhra Pradesh was undivided, Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, Kerala, Karnataka, and Tamil Nadu, the total decadal growth was less than 16%. But then if you look at the specifics, Kerala had the lowest growth rate in the country, which is 4.9% in that decade, which meant that the average growth per year of our population is not even half of 1%. I'm not a demographer, but my common sense tells me that had we had a census in 2011, we might have gone from 0.49% to zero, or maybe even negative population growth. That is the reality that we are facing in our state. We are growing at 1/5 of Bihar's growth rate. So this is something we really have to look at very, very carefully. And if you look at a longer time frame, take 71 to 2011, 71 when that amendment was passed, when the last census that was counted was passed to 2011, Kerala's population in these 40 years grew only 56%. Rajasthan in the same 40 years grew 166%. So you have to understand there is a major change taking place in this country. That partially is also manifest in the dominance of Hindi, for example, where now arguably an actual majority of the population does speak Hindi, though that's not yet in the 2011 census. But the fact is that now you're seeing that the Hindi-speaking northern states, the classic, if you like, states of Aryavrata, they have become demographically disproportionately heavy in the national calculus. So what we're looking at is, in a situation that a state like Kerala or a state like Tamil Nadu, if you do well in health, you actually get less money for health. You do well in population control, you get less money for your population. You do well in education, you get less money for education. And while our finance minister rightly said we have all the schools and so on we need, if you look at the condition of those schools, Mr. Finance Minister, your education minister desperately needs more money to just bring them up. Today I had a government school principal coming to me practically in tears about the condition of a school in my constituency. And everything from the classrooms to everything. You name any basic physical plant, it is all in dilapidated condition. So we need money. It's not that because we have built schools, we can afford to do with less money for education, but that is what is happening in practice. I don't want to just stop at the question of the fact that our reward for good performance is lower tax revenues from the center. There is also a pattern from the federal government that we have to worry about when it comes to the allocation of resources in a federal system for certain calamities. I'll give you one example. During the COVID pandemic, funds had to be allocated from the State Disaster Risk Management Fund, the SDRMF, for relief measures to the individual states. And it was completely botched and inept, where certain favored states received more money than they knew what to do with, and other states where the COVID caseload, especially in the early days, was genuine and high, didn't get enough money. Then, of course, the three-language formula was supposed to be another underpinning of federalism. That too has gone down the tubes in many ways. We in Kerala, I think, maintain the three-language formula. Most children who go to school in Kerala are learning Malayalam, Hindi and English. But that's not true in the north, where if at all anyone bothers to teach them a third language beyond Hindi and English, in many cases English is not taught anyway, it's only Hindi. But if at all there is a third language, it's only going to be Sanskrit. There is no Sanskrit. You can't go to a school in UP and expect to get a third language choice of Tamil or Malayalam. That doesn't happen. That too, to my mind, very seriously undermines the very unity of federal India. The final concern I have is, again, as I said earlier, the political one, which is that as we look at the federal system, what is going to happen in 2026 when the constitutional amendment of 71 lapses? There are only two possibilities. One is that within the existing number or slightly more, instead of 543, maybe 600, that you by and large ensure that no state loses parliamentary representation, but many states will gain. That's one formula, and in that formula, my expectation is it won't be 600. It'll probably be, as we have been hearing, well over 700 members of parliament in the Lok Sabha in order to give many more states and many more seats to some of the northern states. Currently, for example, Kerala has 20 seats with a population of about 40 million. And UP with a population of 220 million is 80 seats. So that's 4 times, even though their population is more like 5.5 times our size. But in the formula that I'm hearing talked about, we are likely to see, if Kerala remains at 20, UP going up from 80 seats to at least 120. And again, the disproportion and the imbalance will change. Now, once you take all the southern states into consideration, Andhra is also, like Kerala, in a very significant downward trend when it comes to demography. Tamil Nadu has not lost as much population, but certainly they're much closer to us in terms of trends than the northern states. When you look at it on the whole, you're going to end up in a situation in which it will be impossible for the southern states to, for example, block a constitutional amendment, because the 2/3 of the parliament will consist of people from the northern states and from the, particularly from the Hindi-speaking states. So, for example, every session some BJP MP stands up and says, Hindi hamara rashtra bhasha, hamari rashtra bhasha hona chahiye. Suppose they pass an amendment requiring that. We will not be able to stop it. And Kerala, again, that's not a dramatic issue. We are enormously adaptive and flexible. What happens next door in Tamil Nadu is another matter. This could be a kind of matter that actually threatens the unity and integrity of our country. So it becomes extremely important that we start giving some thought, and this is my final challenge to Mr. Mohan for his next volume. Can we reimagine federalism? Can we reimagine our structure in such a way as to empower states in a formula that does not disenfranchise and disempower them in the brute demographic calculation that otherwise would put us in that bind? I've been, my own mind, flirting with some ideas. One could be to completely change the Rajya Sabha, so that instead of, at the moment, the Rajya Sabha allocations of seats are also roughly proportional to population. So UP has more than 4 times as many Rajya Sabha MPs as Kerala does. Can we create a situation where, for example, all states have the same number of MPs? And what is more, that you require a certain supermajority before you constitutional amendment can pass the upper house? It's a question. If UP has 2 MPs and Kerala has 2 MPs, there's going to be a major uproar upstairs in the north. But this is a formula that may have to be considered. There are other formulae. For example, the American electoral college system is an interesting way they have of electing the president. Could we find something similar to ensure that No one can form a government without, say, at least one of the southern states, at least one of the eastern and northeastern states also voting for them. I don't know. We need experts to sit down and come up with sensible formulae. But there are important challenges ahead of us. Already the pattern that Mr. Balagopal described seems to me to be much more a pattern of uncooperative federalism rather than the cooperative federalism we've been hearing about for some time. And in these circumstances, it seems to me all the more essential that we move the country in the interests of all of us. We in Kerala would be lost without the North, because half our Malayalis are going and working there. What we need is to make sure that the North and we in the South are on the same page within the same national imagination. And I think this timely history and current survey of our present trends is a very valuable contribution to this. And I want to congratulate Mr. Mohan on his book, India's Federal Setup. Congratulate the Gulati Institute of Finance and Taxation for having brought it out and presented it to us today. And I wish the book all success. And I hope further work by Mr. Mohan will take us to the next stage that awaits us all. Thank you very much. Jai Hind.